Captain Sarah Viper Chen sat in the back corner of Nellis Air Force Base's enlisted club at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, nursing her third cup of coffee and pretending to read maintenance manuals while the real pilots swapped war stories 3 tables away. To anyone watching, she looked like just another washout, a former hotshot who couldn't cut it when it mattered, relegated to training desk duty and slowly drinking herself into obscurity. What they didn't know was that in 6 months, this same woman would execute the most audacious close air support mission in military history, single-handedly extracting 300 Marines from certain death in the mountains of Afghanistan using an A-10 Thunderbolt that everyone said she'd never be qualified to fly in combat. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that she could see the A-10s through the club's grimy windows, their distinctive twin engines and straight wings cutting stark silhouettes against the Nevada desert sky. Those aircraft had been her obsession since childhood, when her grandfather had shown her grainy footage of Warthog's devastating Iraqi tank columns during the Gulf War. "That's what real close air support looks like," he'd told her, his weathered hands steady despite the Parkinson's that would eventually claim him. "Those pilots don't just drop bombs and fly home. They stick around, they protect the ground troops, they bring everyone home." Sarah had carried those words through the Air Force Academy, where she'd graduated third in her class with a specialty in attack aircraft operations. She'd excelled in every simulation, mastered every system, and earned the call sign Viper for her precision during live-fire exercises. Her instructors had called her a natural, predicting she'd become one of the finest A-10 pilots in the Air Force. But natural talent, as Sarah learned the hard way, meant nothing when politics and prejudice entered the equation. The fall had come swiftly and without warning during her final qualification for combat deployment. Sarah had been executing a complex close air support scenario, threading 30mm cannon fire between friendly and enemy positions with surgical precision, when Captain Marcus Webb's voice crackled through her headset loud enough for everyone in the control tower to hear. Webb, the squadron's golden boy with perfect teeth and a father who happened to be a 2-star general, had been monitoring her performance with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for suspected security threats. "Negative, Viper," Webb's voice had carried clearly through the radio, his tone dripping with condescension. "You're too aggressive on that gun run. Female pilots always overcompensate, trying to prove they belong in attack aircraft. You're going to get ground troops killed with that cowboy mentality." The accusation had stung not because it was harsh, but because it was completely unfounded. Sarah's gun runs had been textbook perfect, her spacing precise, her target identification flawless. She'd scored higher than any pilot in her class, including Webb himself. But when the squadron commander reviewed the exercise footage, Webb's commentary had somehow become the official assessment. "Lacks the temperament for close air support. Recommend reassignment to transport or training duties." 3 weeks later, Sarah's father had suffered a massive heart attack while working on his old Mustang in the garage behind their house in Colorado Springs. The timing felt like more than coincidence. The stress of watching his daughter's dreams evaporate had taken its toll on the man who'd spent 30 years as an Air Force mechanic, who taught her to love aircraft before she could properly ride a bicycle. At the funeral, dressed in her dress blues and fighting back tears, Sarah had made a decision that would define the next phase of her life. She'd accepted the assignment to Nellis Air Force Base as a training instructor, a position that kept her close to aircraft, while effectively ending any hope of combat deployment. For 3 years, she'd taught eager young pilots the fundamentals of A-10 operations, watching them progress to combat squadrons while she remained anchored to the desert training facility. During the day, she was the competent but unremarkable Captain Chen, delivering dry lectures on weapons systems and emergency procedures. But after hours, when the base grew quiet and the maintenance crews went home, Sarah became someone else entirely. The A-10 simulators in Building 47 weren't supposed to be accessible after 1,800 hours, but Sarah had cultivated relationships with the night security guards over the years. Sergeant Rodriguez, a former Army infantry veteran who understood the hunger to stay connected to combat operations, looked the other way when Sarah badged into the simulation facility. "Just make sure everything's shut down properly," he'd tell her with a knowing wink. "And if anyone asks, I never saw you." Those midnight sessions became Sarah's lifeline to the pilot she'd been meant to become. She'd run every scenario imaginable: close air support in urban environments, search and rescue in mountainous terrain, tank-busting missions against overwhelming odds. She studied after-action reports from Iraq and Afghanistan, analyzing how real A-10 pilots had handled impossible situations. She memorized the specifications of every variant of the aircraft, from the original A-10A to the modernized A-10C with its advanced targeting systems. More importantly, she developed techniques that went beyond standard training protocols. Sarah had discovered that the A-10's legendary durability could be pushed even further than most pilots realized. She'd found ways to extend the aircraft's loiter time over targets, maximize ammunition effectiveness, and execute gun runs from angles that conventional wisdom deemed too risky. Her simulator scores were off the charts, but simulator scores didn't matter when you were permanently grounded from combat operations. The closest Sarah came to real flying was the occasional maintenance test flight, checking aircraft systems after major repairs or modifications. These flights were supposed to be routine, following predetermined flight paths at safe altitudes. But Sarah had discovered that the maintenance flight protocols left significant room for interpretation, and she'd used that latitude to conduct her own private training sessions. Flying at legal altitudes over the Nevada Test and Training Range, she'd practiced emergency procedures, weapons system operations, and close air support techniques that kept her skills razor-sharp. Her apartment off-base had become a shrine to A-10 operations. The walls were covered with aircraft photographs, technical diagrams, and maps of various combat theaters. She'd collected every book, manual, and article about close air support operations, building a library that would have impressed veteran pilots. Her laptop contained gigabytes of combat footage, training videos, and tactical analyses that she'd studied with the dedication of a doctoral candidate researching her dissertation. But the most important item in her apartment was a small wooden box that sat on her kitchen table, containing her grandfather's Distinguished Flying Cross from World War II. Staff Sergeant William Chen had earned the medal flying P-47 Thunderbolts over Europe, providing close air support for advancing Allied forces. The citation spoke of extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty while participating in sustained combat operations. But Sarah knew the real story from family legends passed down through 3 generations. During the Battle of the Bulge, her grandfather had repeatedly flown through severe weather and heavy anti-aircraft fire to support surrounded American forces. When his squadron was ordered to withdraw due to impossible conditions, he'd volunteered for one final mission to resupply isolated troops with ammunition and medical supplies. Flying alone through a snowstorm that had grounded every other aircraft, he'd made 4 separate runs at treetop level, delivering critical supplies that had allowed the surrounded forces to hold their positions until relief arrived. The measure of a pilot, he'd told her during one of their last conversations before his death, isn't how they perform when everything goes according to plan. It's what they do when the mission seems impossible, when everyone else has given up, when the only thing standing between life and death is your willingness to risk everything for people you've never met. Those words had sustained Sarah through 3 years of professional exile. She'd maintained her edge, honed her skills, and prepared for a moment she wasn't even sure would ever come. But every night, as she ran one more simulation or studied one more tactical manual, she could feel her grandfather's presence, reminding her that some callings run deeper than career advancement or official recognition. The other instructors at Nellis had long since written her off as a has-been, someone who'd had her chance and blown it. Captain Webb, now a major and squadron operations officer, occasionally crossed her path in the hallways, offering condescending smiles and comments about, quote, finding your niche in the training world. The younger pilots she instructed were respectful but distant, understanding that she represented a cautionary tale about what happened when you couldn't handle the pressure of real combat operations. What none of them understood was that Sarah Chen hadn't been broken by her fall from grace. She'd been forged by it. Every slight, every dismissive comment, every reminder that she wasn't good enough for combat operations had only strengthened her resolve. She'd transformed rejection into motivation, using her exile as an opportunity to become better than she'd ever been as a rising star. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The A-10 community was small and tight-knit, with pilots rotating between squadrons and sharing war stories at conferences and training exercises. Through careful listening and strategic questioning, Sarah had built an unofficial network of contacts who kept her informed about developments in combat operations. She knew which units were deploying where, what new tactics were being developed, and how the aging A-10 fleet was being modernized for 21st-century warfare. She'd also become an expert on the aircraft's limitations and capabilities in ways that most active pilots never bothered to explore. Sarah understood the A-10's fuel consumption patterns under various combat conditions, its ammunition loadout options for different mission types, and the emergency procedures that could keep a damaged aircraft flying when conventional wisdom said it should be on the ground. This knowledge had been gained through thousands of hours of study and simulation, creating a depth of expertise that surpassed many pilots who'd actually flown combat missions. But expertise without opportunity remained just academic knowledge, and Sarah had resigned herself to a career spent watching others live the dream she'd been denied. She'd found ways to make peace with her situation, channeling her passion into training the next generation of A-10 pilots as effectively as possible. If she couldn't fly combat missions herself, at least she could ensure that the pilots she trained were as prepared as possible for the challenges they'd face. The irony was that Sarah's reputation as a training instructor had become somewhat legendary within the A-10 community. Pilots who'd been through her courses spoke of her uncanny ability to anticipate scenarios they'd encounter in combat, her detailed knowledge of enemy tactics, and her insistence on training beyond the minimum standards. Several combat veterans had privately told colleagues that Captain Chen's training had saved their lives in actual combat situations. Yet this reputation only served to highlight the absurdity of her situation. The Air Force had one of its most knowledgeable A-10 experts teaching classroom courses while less qualified pilots flew combat missions. It was a waste of talent that would have been comical if it weren't so tragic. A bureaucratic decision that prioritized politics over competence and left everyone worse off as a result. As Sarah sat in the enlisted club that Tuesday afternoon, watching the real pilots prepare for another deployment to Afghanistan, she had no way of knowing that her 3 years of preparation were about to be put to the ultimate test. In a conference room across the base, intelligence officers were analyzing reports of a major Taliban offensive that would soon place 300 Marines in mortal danger, creating a situation that would require exactly the kind of precision flying that Sarah had been perfecting in secret. The storm clouds gathering over the Hindu Kush Mountains were both literal and metaphorical, representing weather conditions that would ground conventional aircraft while creating the desperate circumstances that would finally give Sarah Chen the chance to prove what everyone should have recognized years earlier. She was one of the finest A-10 pilots the Air Force had ever produced, and the world was about to find out what happened when 3 years of suppressed excellence finally found its moment to shine. The destruction of Sarah's combat aviation career began on a scorching Thursday morning in September, 6 months after she'd arrived at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, fresh from advanced A-10 training with sterling recommendations and unshakable confidence. She'd been assigned to the 355th Fighter Squadron, known as the Fighting Falcons, where veteran pilots with combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan were supposed to mentor promising newcomers before their first deployments. Sarah had approached the assignment with the eager anticipation of someone who dreamed of flying close air support missions since childhood, believing that merit and dedication would be sufficient to earn her place among the elite. Captain Webb had been waiting for her in the squadron-ready room that first day, his perfectly pressed flight suit and gleaming wings creating an immediate impression of military precision. Webb came from Air Force royalty. His father was Brigadier General Harrison Webb, a decorated F-16 pilot who'd commanded fighter wings across 3 different theaters. Marcus had inherited not just his father's connections, but also his absolute certainty that some people belonged in combat aircraft and others simply didn't. When he looked at Sarah that morning, sizing up the compact Asian-American woman with determined eyes and a firm handshake, he'd already made his assessment. "So you're our new nugget," Webb had said, using the squadron's term for inexperienced pilots. "Hope you're ready for the real world, Chen. This isn't the training command where everyone gets participation trophies." His tone carried just enough friendliness to maintain plausible deniability, while establishing the hierarchy that would define their relationship for the months that followed. The first few weeks had proceeded normally, with Sarah excelling in every training evolution while Webb maintained a veneer of professional mentorship. She dominated the academics, scoring perfect marks on systems, knowledge, and tactical procedures. Her simulator performance had been flawless, earning praise from instructors who'd seen hundreds of pilots transition from training to operational status. Even her initial flights in the A-10 had gone smoothly, with Sarah adapting quickly to the aircraft's unique characteristics, and demonstrating the kind of instinctive feel for the machine that separated good pilots from great ones. But Webb had been watching, cataloging every interaction and building a narrative that would later prove devastating. He'd noted how Sarah asked more questions than her male counterparts, interpreting intellectual curiosity as lack of confidence. He'd observed her methodical preparation for each flight, twisting thoroughness into evidence of anxiety. Most importantly, he'd begun documenting what he characterized as aggressive tendencies during training exercises, transforming her precise flying into dangerous recklessness through carefully crafted incident reports. The squadron culture at Davis-Monthan reflected the broader challenges facing women in combat aviation during the early 2010s. While official policies supported integration, the informal networks that determined career advancement remained dominated by men who'd grown up in an exclusively male fighter pilot culture. Happy hour conversations at the officers' club rarely included the squadron's few female pilots. Professional development opportunities seemed to flow through channels that bypassed women, and the subtle signals of acceptance or rejection were transmitted through a complex social code that favored traditional masculine behaviors. Sarah had navigated these challenges with the same determination she'd applied to every other obstacle in her military career. She'd focused on performance rather than politics, believing that exceptional flying would eventually overcome any initial skepticism about her place in the squadron. This approach had worked during her academy years and throughout flight training, where objective standards provided clear measures of success. But operational squadrons operated according to different rules, where subjective assessments of leadership potential and combat readiness could be influenced by factors having nothing to do with actual flying ability. The turning point came during a major training exercise called Red Flag, held at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. Red Flag represented the closest thing to actual combat that pilots could experience without deploying overseas, featuring complex scenarios with realistic enemy threats and challenging weather conditions. For young pilots like Sarah, Red Flag offered the opportunity to demonstrate their readiness for combat operations, while training alongside some of the most experienced aviators in the Air Force. Sarah's assigned mission for the exercise involved providing close air support for simulated ground forces under attack by enemy armor. The scenario required precise coordination between air and ground elements, with pilots having to distinguish between friendly and hostile forces while delivering ordnance in close proximity to American troops. It was exactly the kind of mission that A-10 pilots trained for, combining the aircraft's legendary accuracy with the pilot's judgment and skill. From the moment she strapped into her A-10 that morning, Sarah felt the familiar surge of confidence that came from sitting in an aircraft she understood better than most people understood their automobiles. The pre-flight checks were automatic, muscle memory taking over as her hands moved across switches and indicators with practiced efficiency. The engine start was smooth, the systems checks were normal, and the taxi to the runway proceeded without incident. As she lined up for takeoff, Sarah felt ready to prove that she belonged among the Air Force's finest close air support pilots. The flight to the training area proceeded normally, with Sarah maintaining precise formation with her flight lead while monitoring radio communications from the ground forces they would be supporting. The weather was challenging but manageable, with scattered clouds and moderate winds that would test piloting skills without creating genuinely dangerous conditions. As they approached the target area, Sarah could see the simulated enemy positions marked by smoke generators and the friendly forces indicated by orange panels that served as identification markers. The first attack run was textbook perfect. Sarah rolled in on the target with precise timing, acquired the designated enemy position through her targeting pod, and delivered her simulated ordnance with an accuracy that would have been lethal in actual combat. Her spacing from friendly forces was appropriate, her attack angle was optimal, and her post-attack maneuvering was smooth and professional. The ground controllers confirmed a direct hit on the enemy target with no danger to friendly forces. But as Sarah climbed away from the target area, Webb's voice crackled through her headset with a transmission that would haunt her for years to come. "Negative, Viper," he said, his tone carrying across the radio frequencies so that every pilot participating in the exercise could hear his assessment. "That gun run was too aggressive. You're danger close to friendlies and showing the kind of cowboy mentality that gets ground troops killed. Female pilots always overcompensate trying to prove they belong in attack aircraft." The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow, not just because it was professionally devastating, but because it was completely false. Her attack had been executed exactly according to established procedures, with proper spacing and appropriate safety margins. The ground controllers had confirmed successful target engagement with no danger to friendly forces. Every objective measure indicated that her performance had been exemplary. Yet Webb's public criticism transformed success into failure through the simple expedient of claiming otherwise. Sarah's response was immediate and professional. Flight lead, request clarification. My attack parameters were within established guidelines, and ground control confirmed successful engagement with adequate separation from friendlies. She kept her voice calm and factual, hoping that Webb would recognize his error and correct the record. Instead, his reply made the situation even worse. Viper, when you've got a few combat tours under your belt, you can question my assessment of close air support procedures. Until then, I suggest you focus on learning proper attack techniques instead of arguing with your superiors. The dismissal was complete and public, establishing a narrative that would follow Sarah through the remainder of the exercise and back to Davis-Monthan. The flight back to base passed in tense silence, with Sarah replaying the engagement over and over in her mind while trying to understand what had gone wrong. She'd executed the attack exactly as trained, followed all established procedures, and achieved the desired tactical result. Yet Webb's criticism suggested fundamental flaws in her performance that she simply couldn't identify. The cognitive dissonance between her own assessment and his feedback created a doubt that began eating away at her confidence. The post-flight debrief was even worse than the radio exchange. Webb presented his analysis of Sarah's performance to the assembled pilots and instructors, using carefully selected still images from the targeting pod footage to support his claims about dangerous flying. He pointed to moments where Sarah's aircraft appeared close to friendly positions, ignoring the fact that the images were taken from angles that distorted actual distances. He characterized her precise maneuvering as erratic, and her quick target acquisition as rushed and potentially dangerous. Most damaging of all, Webb framed his criticism within the broader context of gender integration in combat aviation. This is exactly why we need to be careful about lowering standards, he told the room full of male pilots and instructors. When people feel pressure to prove they belong somewhere they don't naturally fit, they tend to overcompensate in ways that can be dangerous to everyone involved. The implication was clear. Women in general, and Sarah in particular, represented a threat to the safety and effectiveness of combat operations. Sarah attempted to defend her performance, presenting her own analysis of the mission timeline and highlighting the successful target engagement confirmed by ground controllers. But her factual rebuttal was dismissed as defensiveness, and her request for objective review of the targeting pod footage was characterized as an inability to accept constructive criticism. The narrative had been established, and contradictory evidence was simply absorbed into the broader story of a female pilot who couldn't handle the pressure of combat aviation. The weeks following Red Flag saw a systematic campaign to document what Webb characterized as ongoing performance deficiencies. Sarah's thorough mission planning became, quote, excessive preparation indicating anxiety about flying. Her precise execution of procedures was reframed as rigid adherence to checklist items without tactical flexibility. Her questions about tactical scenarios were interpreted as lack of confidence in basic aviation skills. Every strength was transformed into a weakness through the simple expedient of malicious interpretation. Other squadron members began to distance themselves from Sarah as word spread about Webb's assessment of her performance. The informal networks that determined everything from flight assignments to social invitations gradually excluded her, creating an isolation that reinforced the narrative of someone who didn't fit in with the squadron culture. Conversation stopped when she entered rooms, professional development opportunities went to other pilots, and the thousand small interactions that build camaraderie within military units began to dry up. The final blow came during a formal evaluation session 6 weeks after Red Flag. Webb, now serving as Sarah's official mentor and supervisor, presented a comprehensive assessment that painted her as fundamentally unsuited for combat operations. The document was a masterpiece of bureaucratic character assassination, using official language and regulatory references to create a seemingly objective case for her removal from combat aviation. Captain Chen demonstrates technical proficiency in basic flying skills, the evaluation read, but lacks the temperament and judgment required for close air support operations in combat environments. Her tendency toward aggressive tactics, combined with apparent inability to accept guidance from experienced combat veterans, raises serious concerns about her suitability for deployment to hostile theaters. Recommend reassignment to non-combat duties pending further evaluation of psychological fitness for military aviation. The evaluation was devastating not just because of its conclusions but because of its timing. Sarah had been scheduled for deployment to Afghanistan with the squadron's next rotation, an assignment that would have provided the combat experience necessary for career advancement in the A-10 community. Instead, she found herself facing a choice between accepting Webb's recommendation for reassignment or challenging the evaluation through formal channels that would likely end her aviation career entirely. The decision was made even more difficult by the sudden deterioration in her father's health. Master Sergeant Robert Chen, a career Air Force mechanic who'd spent 30 years maintaining the aircraft his daughter now flew, had been experiencing chest pains and shortness of breath that doctors initially attributed to work-related chemical exposure. But as Sarah struggled with the implications of Webb's evaluation, her father's condition worsened rapidly, culminating in a massive heart attack that left him hospitalized in critical condition. Faced with her father's medical crisis and the destruction of her own career prospects, Sarah made a decision that would define the next phase of her life. She accepted Webb's recommendation for reassignment to training duties, officially ending her hopes for combat deployment while preserving what remained of her aviation career. The choice felt like surrender at the time, but it would later prove to be the beginning of a different kind of preparation for challenges she couldn't yet imagine. The assignment to Nellis Air Force Base arrived on a gray October morning, 3 weeks after Sarah's father's funeral, delivered in a manila envelope that contained both her official transfer orders and the quiet end of everything she'd worked toward since childhood. The paperwork was clinical in its efficiency. Captain Sarah Chen, reassigned from operational duties with the 355th Fighter Squadron to training instructor position with the 66th Weapons Squadron at Nellis AFB, effective immediately. No mention of the circumstances that had led to her exile, no acknowledgement of the dreams being systematically dismantled with each typed line. Sarah's new office in Building 201 was a sterile cube with fluorescent lighting and motivational posters featuring aircraft she would never again fly in combat. Her official duties included developing training curricula for A-10 weapon systems, conducting classroom instruction for incoming pilots, and maintaining proficiency in simulator operations. It was meaningful work that contributed to the broader mission of preparing combat aviators, but it felt like watching life through bulletproof glass, close enough to see what she was missing, far enough away to never touch it again. The 66th Weapons Squadron buzzed with the constant energy of pilots rotating through advanced training courses, but Sarah existed on its periphery like a ghost haunting her former life. The students who filled her classrooms were eager young aviators hungry for the combat deployments she'd been denied, hanging on every word as she explained targeting systems and weapons employment techniques, with the theoretical precision of someone whose knowledge came from manuals rather than experience. They respected her expertise but couldn't hide their curiosity about why such a knowledgeable instructor had never deployed herself. "Ma'am, how many combat missions have you flown?" The question came from Lieutenant Jake Morrison during her 3rd week at Nellis, asked with the innocent directness of someone who assumed competence naturally led to opportunity. Sarah had prepared for this moment, crafting a response that skirted the truth while maintaining her dignity. "My experience comes from extensive training and simulation work," she replied, her voice steady despite the familiar sting of explaining her limitations. Sometimes the best teachers are those who've studied every aspect of a mission without getting caught up in the adrenaline of actual combat. It was a lie wrapped in partial truth, but it satisfied the students' curiosity while preserving the illusion of choice rather than exile. The real education at Nellis happened after official duty hours, when Sarah began her systematic exploration of what she privately called advanced preparation. Her quarters in base housing were spartanly furnished, but for one wall that had become a shrine to A-10 operations. Technical manuals arranged by aircraft variant, tactical publications sorted by theater of operations, and detailed maps of Afghanistan and Iraq marking every location where A-10s had provided close air support. She'd collected maintenance records, pilot debriefs, and after-action reports from every major engagement involving warthogs, building a comprehensive database of how the aircraft performed under actual combat conditions. But reading about combat was a poor substitute for experiencing it, which led Sarah to discover the possibilities hidden within Nellis's extensive training infrastructure. The base housed some of the most sophisticated simulation equipment in the Air Force, including full-motion A-10 simulators that could replicate everything from routine training flights to the most challenging combat scenarios. These simulators were supposed to be available only during official training hours and under instructor supervision, but Sarah's position in the weapons squadron provided access that she began exploiting with careful discretion. Her first unauthorized simulation session took place on a Tuesday night in November, 2 months after her arrival at Nellis. Sarah had volunteered to stay late updating training materials, giving her legitimate reason to be in the building after normal duty hours. When the maintenance staff completed their evening checks and departed, she slipped into Simulator Bay 3 and powered up the most advanced A-10C trainer in the Air Force inventory. The familiar embrace of the cockpit felt like coming home after a long exile. Sarah's hands moved automatically across the instrument panel, muscle memory guiding her through startup procedures as the simulation system hummed to life around her. Within minutes, she was airborne in a virtual A-10, flying over digitally rendered Afghan terrain toward a close air support mission that would test every skill she'd developed during her truncated combat training. The scenario was based on an actual engagement from Helmand Province, where A-10 pilots had supported Marines pinned down by Taliban fighters using a mosque as cover. The mission required precise target identification to avoid civilian casualties, accurate weapons delivery in close proximity to friendly forces, and sustained operations over a rapidly evolving battlefield. It was exactly the kind of challenge that Sarah had been training for before Webb's intervention derailed her career. As she rolled in on the first target, Sarah felt the familiar surge of confidence that came from perfect harmony between pilot and aircraft. Her target acquisition was instantaneous, her weapons delivery precise, her post-attack maneuvering smooth and professional. The simulated ground controller's voice crackled through her headset. "Outstanding run, Hog. Direct hit on target building with no collateral damage. Enemy fire has ceased in Sector 2. For the next 2 hours, Sarah flew mission after mission, each scenario more challenging than the last. She provided close air support for troops in contact, conducted search and rescue operations in mountainous terrain, and executed tank-busting runs against armored columns. Her performance was flawless, her scores consistently exceeding the standards expected of combat-qualified pilots. But most importantly, she felt alive in a way that had been missing since her reassignment to training duties. The unauthorized simulator sessions became Sarah's lifeline to the pilot she'd been meant to become. 3 nights a week, she slipped into the training building after hours and flew virtual combat missions that tested every aspect of her skills. She practiced emergency procedures that pushed the A-10's legendary durability to its limits, executed weapons employment techniques from angles that conventional training deemed too risky, and developed tactics for scenarios that standard curricula never addressed. Sarah's simulator work was guided by meticulous study of actual combat reports and tactical analyses that she'd begun collecting from every available source. She subscribed to professional aviation journals, monitored online forums where combat pilots discussed lessons learned, and cultivated relationships with maintenance personnel who had access to classified after-action reports. This research provided the foundation for increasingly sophisticated training scenarios that went far beyond standard qualification requirements. The breakthrough came during a simulation based on the Battle of Kamdesh in eastern Afghanistan, where outnumbered American forces had fought off a massive Taliban assault on combat outpost Keating. Sarah had recreated the engagement using declassified tactical reports and geographic data, programming the simulator to replicate the challenging terrain and complex threat environment that had made the battle so difficult. The scenario required sustained close air support operations in mountainous terrain, with multiple friendly positions scattered across a valley floor and enemy forces occupying high ground on all sides. As Sarah flew the simulated mission, she discovered tactics that went beyond anything she'd learned in formal training. The extreme terrain channeled aircraft along predictable flight paths that enemy gunners could anticipate, but she found that aggressive maneuvering at lower altitudes could exploit blind spots in the mountainous landscape. By using ridgelines as cover and timing her attacks to coincide with friendly artillery strikes, she could deliver ordnance with devastating effectiveness while minimizing exposure to ground fire. More importantly, she learned to push the A-10 systems beyond their normal parameters in ways that increased mission effectiveness without compromising safety. The aircraft's GAU-8 cannon could be employed in burst patterns that maximized ammunition conservation while maintaining suppressive fire against multiple targets. The targeting pod could be used for battlefield illumination during night operations, providing ground forces with additional situational awareness. Even the landing gear could serve tactical purposes, creating additional drag during steep diving attacks that allowed more precise weapons delivery. These innovations remained hidden within Sarah's private training regimen, unknown to the instructors and students who saw only the competent but unremarkable Captain Chen delivering classroom lectures on standard procedures. She'd learned to compartmentalize her existence, maintaining professional relationships during duty hours, while pursuing her true calling during the stolen moments when she could slip away from official oversight. The physical demands of her covert training program began taking their toll by spring. Sarah's official duties required full attention during normal working hours, but her evening simulation sessions often extended past midnight, creating a schedule that left little time for sleep or relaxation. She subsisted on energy drinks and determination, driven by an obsession that she recognized as potentially unhealthy but couldn't bring herself to abandon. Her apartment became a monastery dedicated to the study of close air support operations. Technical manuals covered every surface, tactical diagrams decorated the walls, and multiple computer monitors displayed satellite imagery from various combat theaters. She'd memorized the specifications of every A-10 variant, studied the maintenance history of individual aircraft, and analyzed the combat records of pilots whose careers she envied with desperate intensity. The isolation was perhaps the most challenging aspect of her exile. Sarah's former squadron mates had moved on to combat deployments and career advancement, sharing war stories and professional achievements that she could only experience vicariously through their social media posts and chance encounters at professional conferences. She maintained cordial relationships with fellow instructors at Nellis, but the casual friendships of shared duty were shallow compared to the bonds forged by combat veterans who'd trusted each other with their lives. Sarah's family provided emotional support during scheduled phone calls and holiday visits, but they couldn't truly understand the depth of her professional frustration. Her mother worried about her increasingly solitary lifestyle, while her younger brother suggested she consider transitioning to civilian aviation, where gender discrimination might be less entrenched. These conversations were well-intentioned, but served only to highlight how completely her military identity had become intertwined with her sense of self-worth. The lowest point came during a chance encounter with Marcus Webb at a professional conference in Las Vegas. Now Major Webb, his career advancing along the predictable trajectory of successful combat pilots, he approached Sarah with the patronizing friendliness of someone secure in his own success. "Sarah, good to see you," he said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "How are things in the training world? I hear you're doing good work with the new pilots." The subtext was unmistakable. He'd successfully consigned her to a subordinate role and felt magnanimous enough to acknowledge her reduced circumstances. "The work is rewarding," Sarah replied, maintaining professional courtesy while suppressing the urge to mention that several of his former students had privately credited her instruction with saving their lives in combat. "I hope your deployments are going well." "Can't complain," Webb said, straightening his service dress uniform that now bore the ribbons of multiple combat tours. "Just finished my third rotation to Afghanistan. The A-10 community is pretty tight-knit. Everyone knows everyone. I'm sure you'll find your niche eventually." The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but its impact lingered for weeks. Webb's casual dismissal of her expertise, his assumption that she'd failed to find her proper place in military aviation, crystallized everything Sarah had lost, and everything she'd been systematically denied. That night, she flew her most aggressive simulation session yet, pushing virtual A-10s through scenarios that would have challenged the most experienced combat pilots. As her second year at Nellis approached, Sarah had accumulated thousands of hours of simulated combat experience, mastered tactical procedures that went far beyond standard training requirements, and developed innovations that could revolutionize close air support operations. But this expertise remained hidden within computer databases and classified training records, known only to automated scoring systems that recorded her extraordinary performance without human witnesses to validate its significance. She'd become the Air Force's most qualified combat pilot, who'd never flown a combat mission, a tactical expert whose innovations were invisible to the community that could benefit from them. The irony was particularly bitter, because her students regularly received combat assignments based on training that she'd designed and instruction that she'd provided, carrying her knowledge into battle while she remained anchored to the Nevada desert. Yet Sarah persisted in her preparation, driven by an faith that bordered on obsession. Somewhere in the chaos of global military operations, she believed there would eventually be a situation requiring exactly the skills she'd developed in secret. When that moment arrived, she intended to be ready to prove what everyone should have recognized from the beginning, that Captain Sarah Chen was one of the finest A-10 pilots the Air Force had ever produced, regardless of the politics that had buried her potential beneath 3 years of bureaucratic exile. The arrival of Lieutenant Colonel David Hammer Krueger at Nellis Air Force Base on a blazing Monday morning in July marked the beginning of Sarah's darkest period since her exile from combat aviation. Krueger came with the kind of reputation that preceded him like artillery fire. A decorated A-10 pilot with 4 combat deployments, 2 distinguished flying crosses, and the unwavering conviction that modern military training had become dangerously soft. His appointment as Director of Advanced Combat Training represented a seismic shift in the 66th Weapons Squadron's philosophy, one that would transform Sarah's already difficult situation into something approaching professional hell. Unlike the previous commanders who'd maintained a benign indifference toward the training staff, Krueger arrived with specific ideas about reforming what he saw as a bloated and ineffective educational bureaucracy. His first all-hands meeting was held in the base theater, where he addressed nearly 300 instructors, students, and support personnel, with the blunt directness that had made him legendary among A-10 pilots. "Ladies and gentlemen," Krueger began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who delivered ordnance in anger across 3 different theaters. "This squadron has developed a reputation for producing pilots who can pass tests but can't fight wars. That changes today." He clicked to his first PowerPoint slide, showing accident statistics and mission effectiveness data that painted an unflattering picture of recent training outcomes. "Our graduates are arriving at combat squadrons with textbook knowledge but no real understanding of what it means to put warheads on foreheads when American lives are on the line," Krueger continued, his gaze sweeping across the assembled audience with predatory intensity. "We're going to fix that by implementing training standards that separate warriors from classroom commandos. Some of you won't like the changes. Some of you probably shouldn't be here anyway." Sarah felt a chill of premonition as Krueger's eyes lingered on the section where training instructors were seated. His message was clear. The comfortable world of academic aviation instruction was about to be replaced by something much more demanding and potentially dangerous. For someone whose expertise remained theoretical rather than combat-tested, this transformation threatened to expose vulnerabilities that had remained hidden within the protective cocoon of routine training duties. The first indication of Krueger's intentions came during a staff meeting the following week, where he outlined his vision for realistic combat simulation that would push both instructors and students beyond their comfort zones. Traditional training scenarios, he argued, were too predictable and forgiving, allowing pilots to develop false confidence that would crumble under the pressure of actual combat operations. Effective immediately, Krueger announced, all advanced training will be conducted using scenarios based on actual combat engagements, where American pilots have been killed or seriously wounded. Students will face the same challenges, the same impossible choices, and the same life-or-death pressure that they'll encounter downrange. Instructors who can't handle these scenarios shouldn't be teaching them. The implications were immediately clear to everyone in the room. Krueger was establishing a new hierarchy based on combat experience, rather than academic credentials or training proficiency. Instructors who'd never been shot at in anger would be required to demonstrate their competence using scenarios drawn from the darkest moments in recent aviation history. For Sarah, who'd spent 3 years building expertise through simulation rather than deployment, this represented an existential threat to her already precarious position. Krueger's contempt for what he called simulation warriors became apparent during his first observation of Sarah's advanced weapons employment class. She was conducting a detailed analysis of close air support procedures in urban environments, using declassified footage from Ramadi and Fallujah to illustrate the complexities of identifying targets while minimizing civilian casualties. Her presentation was comprehensive and technically accurate, drawing on hundreds of hours of research to provide students with insights that would have impressed veteran combat pilots. But when Sarah opened the floor for questions, Krueger interrupted with a comment that silenced the classroom and foreshadowed the campaign he would soon launch against her credibility. "Captain Chen," he said, his voice carrying across the room with deliberate clarity, "your analysis is very thorough from an academic perspective. But I'm curious, when you're teaching these young pilots about the realities of combat, What personal experience are you drawing from? Have you ever actually delivered ordnance in anger? The question hung in the air like unexploded ordnance, its implications clear to everyone present. Sarah maintained her professional composure, but she could feel the weight of 24 pairs of eyes watching her response with sudden interest. Sir, my instruction is based on comprehensive analysis of combat reports, pilot debriefs, and tactical studies conducted by subject matter experts who have extensive combat experience, she replied, choosing her words with careful precision. I believe that rigorous academic study can provide valuable insights that complement operational experience. Krueger's smile was predatory. That's an interesting theory, Captain, but in my experience there's no substitute for having someone actually shoot at you. Academic analysis is fine for understanding what happened, but it can't prepare you for the split-second decisions and pure chaos of real combat. Students, remember that distinction when you're evaluating the advice you receive here. The dismissal was surgical in its precision and devastating in its impact. Krueger had publicly questioned Sarah's credibility without technically violating any regulations, while simultaneously planting seeds of doubt about her instruction in the minds of her students. The message was clear. Theoretical knowledge, no matter how comprehensive, was inferior to combat experience when it came to preparing pilots for the realities of warfare. Over the following weeks, Krueger systematically undermined Sarah's position through a campaign of professional marginalization that was as sophisticated as it was malicious. He began scheduling mandatory instructor meetings during times when Sarah had classes, forcing her to choose between teaching duties and administrative requirements. He reassigned her most advanced courses to instructors with combat experience, relegating her to basic systems instruction that any maintenance technician could have taught. Most damaging of all, Krueger implemented new evaluation criteria for training instructors that heavily weighted combat experience over academic performance or student feedback. Under the new system, instructors were rated on their ability to provide realistic combat perspective based on personal experience in hostile environments. Sarah's consistently excellent student evaluations and comprehensive course materials were suddenly irrelevant compared to her lack of combat ribbons. The psychological pressure was relentless and carefully calculated. Krueger never directly accused Sarah of incompetence or publicly humiliated her in front of large groups, but his constant questioning of her qualifications created an atmosphere of doubt that infected every professional interaction. Students began approaching her with less confidence, colleagues started avoiding casual conversations, and the informal networks that determined everything from duty assignments to social invitations gradually excluded her. Sarah's response was to double down on her preparation, spending even more time in unauthorized simulation sessions while researching increasingly obscure aspects of A-10 operations. She convinced herself that perfect theoretical knowledge could compensate for lack of combat experience, that comprehensive understanding of historical engagements could substitute for personal participation in similar events. Her apartment became even more cluttered with technical manuals and tactical analyses as she desperately tried to bridge the gap between academic expertise and operational credibility. But Krueger's campaign was having its intended effect. Sarah's confidence, built on 3 years of intensive study and simulation work, began eroding under the constant implication that her knowledge was somehow illegitimate because it hadn't been earned through combat deployment. She found herself second-guessing tactical decisions that she'd previously made with certainty, wondering whether her theoretical understanding truly prepared her for the chaos and complexity of real warfare. The situation deteriorated further when Krueger announced a new program called Combat Reality Training, which would require all instructors to demonstrate their competence using scenarios based on the most challenging engagements in recent A-10 history. These simulations would be conducted under observation, with performance evaluations that would directly impact future assignments and career advancement. This isn't about testing your flying skills, Krueger explained during the program briefing. Any competent pilot can execute standard procedures under controlled conditions. This is about testing your ability to make life-or-death decisions under pressure, to adapt when everything goes wrong, to demonstrate the kind of combat judgment that keeps American pilots alive and enemy forces dead. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The scenarios Krueger had selected were notorious within the A-10 community for their difficulty and the real-world casualties they represented. The Battle of Roberts Ridge, where A-10s had provided close air support during a desperate rescue operation on an Afghan mountaintop. The ambush at Sadr City, where precision strikes had been required to support surrounded Army units without causing civilian casualties. The green-on-blue attack at Bagram, where quick thinking by A-10 pilots had prevented a tragedy from becoming a massacre. Each scenario represented not just a tactical challenge but an emotional crucible that tested pilots' ability to function under extreme stress while making decisions with life-or-death consequences. For combat veterans who'd experienced similar pressures, these simulations served as valuable training tools. For instructors like Sarah, whose experience remained theoretical, they represented a form of professional torture designed to expose their limitations in the most humiliating way possible. Sarah's first combat reality training session was scheduled for a Thursday morning in September, giving her 3 weeks to prepare for what she knew would be either vindication or destruction. The scenario assigned to her was based on the 2010 engagement at Combat Outpost Keating in eastern Afghanistan, where A-10 pilots had provided sustained close air support during a massive Taliban assault that nearly overran the isolated American position. The historical engagement had required precise coordination between multiple aircraft, accurate delivery of ordnance in extremely close proximity to friendly forces, and sustained operations over hostile territory despite heavy ground fire. 2 A-10s had been damaged during the battle, and several pilots had been decorated for their performance under impossible conditions. It was exactly the kind of scenario where theoretical knowledge would be insufficient, without the combat experience and instinctive decision-making that came from previous exposure to similar situations. As Sarah prepared for the evaluation, she immersed herself in every available detail about the original battle. She studied terrain maps, analyzed weather data, memorized the positions of friendly and enemy forces, and reviewed pilot debriefs until she could visualize every aspect of the engagement with photographic clarity. Her preparation was more comprehensive than any academic research project, driven by the desperate knowledge that failure would confirm everything Krueger had implied about her unsuitability for serious aviation instruction. But even as Sarah prepared with obsessive thoroughness, she couldn't shake the feeling that Krueger's evaluation was designed to expose weaknesses rather than assess competence. The scenarios were specifically chosen to favor pilots with combat experience, creating conditions where theoretical knowledge would be insufficient and instinctive reactions developed through previous deployments would prove decisive. The night before her evaluation, Sarah lay awake in her quarters staring at the ceiling and contemplating the professional cliff she was about to walk off. 3 years of exile had led to this moment, where her carefully constructed expertise would be tested against standards specifically designed to highlight her limitations. Tomorrow would determine whether she had any future in military aviation, or whether Krueger's campaign would finally succeed in driving her from the Air Force entirely. Outside her window, she could hear the distant sound of A-10s conducting night training flights. Their distinctive engine noise, a reminder of everything she'd been denied and everything she stood to lose. The irony was bitter. She'd become one of the most knowledgeable A-10 tacticians in the Air Force, but that knowledge would count for nothing if she couldn't demonstrate it under the artificial pressure of Krueger's combat reality training program. As dawn approached, Sarah realized that tomorrow's evaluation represented more than just a professional assessment. It was a referendum on whether merit and preparation could overcome institutional bias, whether 3 years of dedicated study could compensate for the combat experience she'd been denied through no fault of her own. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and the outcome would determine not just her immediate future but her entire identity as an aviator and officer. The combat reality training evaluation began at 0800 hours on a cloudless Thursday morning that felt like the day of execution. Sarah arrived at the simulation facility 30 minutes early, her flight suit pressed to perfection, and her mind running through emergency procedures with the mechanical precision of someone who'd rehearsed every possible contingency. The building hummed with nervous energy as other instructors prepared for their own evaluations, but Sarah felt isolated within her own bubble of dread and determination. Lieutenant Colonel Krueger was waiting in the briefing room alongside 2 observers, Major Patricia Santos, a combat veteran with 3 Afghanistan deployments, and Colonel William Hayes, the squadron's deputy commander whose own A-10 experience dated back to the Gulf War. Their presence transformed what should have been a routine training evaluation into something approaching a military tribunal, with Sarah cast in the role of defendant-facing judges who'd already reached their verdict. Captain Chen, Krueger began, his voice carrying the formal tone reserved for official proceedings. Today's evaluation will test your ability to provide realistic combat instruction based on the Battle of Combat Outpost Keating. You'll be expected to execute the mission profile flown by Captain Bradley Williams during the Taliban assault on October 3, 2010. Your performance will be assessed on tactical decision-making, weapons employment accuracy, and most importantly, your ability to demonstrate the kind of combat judgment our students need to survive their first deployment. The scenario briefing was comprehensive and deliberately intimidating. Combat Outpost Keating had been one of the most isolated and vulnerable American positions in Afghanistan, situated at the bottom of a valley surrounded by high ground that provided enemy fighters with commanding fields of fire. On the morning of the attack, approximately 300 Taliban and Haqqani network fighters had launched a coordinated assault designed to overrun the outpost and eliminate its 53 American defenders. Sarah would be flying the profile of Captain Williams, whose A-10 had been the first aircraft to respond when the outpost's desperate radio calls for immediate close air support had crackled through regional command frequencies. Williams had arrived over the target area to find American positions being overrun, friendly forces scattered across multiple buildings within the compound, and enemy fighters advancing through breaches in the perimeter wire. The tactical situation had been chaos incarnate, with life-or-death decisions required every few seconds and no margin for error in target identification. The simulation will begin with you 15 miles out from the target area, Krueger continued, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face as he watched for signs of nervousness or doubt. Communications from the ground will replicate the actual radio traffic from that morning, including the confusion, contradictory information, and emotional stress of soldiers fighting for their lives. Weather conditions will match the historical data, and enemy air defenses will be positioned according to post-battle intelligence assessments. Major Santos leaned forward, her expression professionally neutral but her tone carrying subtle skepticism. Captain Chen, this scenario killed real Americans and wounded many more. The pilots who flew these missions were dealing with genuine life-or-death pressure that affected their decision-making in ways that no simulation can fully replicate. How do you plan to compensate for that experiential gap? The question struck at the heart of Sarah's greatest vulnerability, the lack of combat experience that had defined her entire career trajectory. She'd prepared for this moment, crafting responses that acknowledged her limitations while emphasizing her comprehensive preparation, but facing the actual interrogation felt like standing naked in a spotlight. "Ma'am, I understand that simulation cannot fully replicate the psychological pressure of actual combat," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "However, I believe that thorough preparation, comprehensive knowledge of historical precedents, and disciplined adherence to proven tactical procedures can enable effective decision-making even under extreme stress. My goal is to execute this mission using the same principles and techniques that I teach to students who will face similar challenges in actual combat." Colonel Hayes made a note on his evaluation sheet, his expression unreadable. "Captain, the students you're training will be flying these missions for real within 6 months of graduation. Their lives, and the lives of the ground forces they support, will depend on the quality of instruction they receive here. If you can't demonstrate realistic combat performance yourself, how can you prepare them for situations where theoretical knowledge isn't enough?" The implication was clear. Sarah's theoretical expertise was being dismissed as inadequate preparation for the responsibilities she'd been assigned. The evaluation hadn't even begun, but the panel's assumptions about her limitations were already shaping their assessment of her competence. She felt the familiar burn of institutional dismissal, but this time it carried higher stakes than personal career advancement. "Sir, I believe that comprehensive understanding of tactical principles combined with rigorous analysis of successful combat techniques provides a solid foundation for instruction," Sarah responded, fighting to keep defensiveness from creeping into her voice. "While I acknowledge that combat experience provides valuable insights, I've spent 3 years studying every aspect of close air support operations with a level of detail that most operational pilots don't have time to develop." Krueger's smile was predatory. "We'll see about that, Captain. Time to step into the simulator and show us what 3 years of academic study can accomplish when American lives are on the line." The walk to Simulator Bay 2 felt like a condemned prisoner's final march. Sarah's hands were steady as she completed the pre-flight checks, but her mind was racing through contingencies and tactical procedures with the desperate intensity of someone whose entire future depended on the next 2 hours. The familiar embrace of the A-10 cockpit provided some comfort, but she could feel the weight of observation from the evaluation panels seated at monitoring stations behind bulletproof glass. The simulation began with Sarah's aircraft approaching the Kamdesh Valley from the south, flying through scattered clouds at 15,000 feet while monitoring the increasingly frantic radio communications from Combat Outpost Keating. The historical audio had been recreated with disturbing accuracy, featuring the actual voices of American soldiers describing enemy positions, casualty reports, and desperate requests for immediate air support. Any aircraft, this is Keating Base," the radio crackled with the voice of a young soldier whose fear was barely controlled beneath professional military communications protocols. "We are under heavy attack from all directions. Enemy forces have breached the perimeter and are advancing on the command post. We need immediate close air support, or we're going to be overrun." Sarah's response was immediate and professional, despite the simulated adrenaline that the system was designed to induce through audio cues and visual effects. "Keating Base, this is Hog 27, A-10 inbound from the south with full combat load. I can be on station in 8 minutes. Can you provide enemy positions in friendly locations?" The next few minutes tested every aspect of Sarah's preparation as she absorbed tactical information while navigating through increasingly complex airspace. The ground controller's voice provided fragmentary intelligence about enemy positions, but the tactical picture was confused and constantly changing as Taliban fighters advanced through different sectors of the compound. American forces were scattered across multiple buildings, some cut off from the main defensive positions and unable to provide accurate updates on their locations. As Sarah approached the target area, she could see the simulation's recreation of the actual battle. Muzzle flashes from enemy weapons positioned on high ground surrounding the valley, smoke rising from burning buildings within the outpost, and the chaotic movement of figures that could be either friendly forces or attacking Taliban fighters. The visual complexity was overwhelming, requiring split-second decisions about target identification while maintaining situational awareness of multiple threats and friendly positions. Her first gun run was textbook perfect, despite the pressure of knowing that 3 experienced combat pilots were analyzing every aspect of her performance. Sarah identified a confirmed enemy position on the eastern ridgeline, rolled in with optimal attack geometry, and delivered a precise burst from the GAU-8 cannon that neutralized the threat without endangering nearby friendly forces. The ground controller's voice confirmed the successful engagement, but there was no time to celebrate as new threats emerged across the battlefield. "Outstanding run, Hog 27. The controller's voice carried relief and renewed hope. "You got them. We've got more enemy positions on the North Ridge, approximately 200 meters from our northernmost building. Can you engage those positions next?" Sarah's response demonstrated the tactical flexibility that she'd developed through countless hours of unauthorized simulation practice. Rather than executing a standard attack pattern that enemy gunners could anticipate, she used the mountainous terrain to mask her approach, coming in from an unexpected angle that minimized her exposure to ground fire while maximizing the effectiveness of her weapons delivery. The engagement was flawless, with Sarah's cannon fire precisely eliminating enemy positions, while her post-attack maneuvering carried her clear of the target area before hostile forces could respond. But the simulation was designed to test sustained performance under pressure, and new challenges emerged faster than individual threats could be neutralized. Over the next hour, Sarah flew mission profile after mission profile, each engagement more challenging than the last, as the tactical situation evolved to match the historical complexity of the actual battle. She provided close air support for a rescue operation when American forces attempted to reach isolated defenders, delivered precision strikes against enemy positions that were dangerously close to friendly forces, and coordinated with helicopter gunships and artillery units to maximize the effectiveness of combined arms operations. Throughout the evaluation, Sarah's performance exceeded every established standard for A-10 operations. Her target identification was instantaneous and accurate, her weapons employment was precise and effective, and her tactical decision-making demonstrated the kind of combat judgment that kept friendly forces alive while maximizing damage to enemy positions. She flew with the confidence and competence of a pilot who'd conducted hundreds of similar missions, drawing on 3 years of intensive preparation to compensate for her lack of actual combat experience. But the most challenging aspect of the evaluation came during the final phase, when Sarah was required to make a decision that had no clear tactical solution. The ground controller reported that American forces were pinned down in a building that was being approached by enemy fighters carrying explosives, with friendly casualties mounting and ammunition running dangerously low. The only way to stop the attack was to deliver ordnance within 30 meters of American positions, well within the danger zone for friendly fire casualties. In the actual battle, Captain Williams had made the decision to engage despite the risk, trusting his judgment and the accuracy of his aircraft to save American lives. The strike had been successful, but only because Williams had possessed the combat experience and instinctive decision-making that allowed him to execute an attack that textbook procedures would have prohibited. Sarah faced the same impossible choice, with 3 combat veterans watching to see whether her theoretical knowledge could substitute for the kind of instinctive judgment that came from previous exposure to similar life-or-death decisions. The radio crackled with increasingly desperate pleas from the ground controller, while her targeting display showed friendly and enemy positions separated by distances that made accurate weapons delivery extremely challenging. For a moment that felt like an eternity, Sarah hesitated. Every regulation, every safety procedure, and every training protocol she'd ever studied argued against engaging targets so close to friendly forces. But the simulated voices of American soldiers fighting for their lives provided a counter-argument that transcended academic caution, and Sarah realized that this moment represented the culmination of everything she'd been preparing for during 3 years of exile. She rolled in on the target with aggressive precision, using every technique she'd developed during her unauthorized training sessions to deliver ordnance with surgical accuracy. The cannon burst was perfectly placed, neutralizing the enemy threat while avoiding friendly casualties through a combination of skill, preparation, and the kind of calculated risk-taking that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. Direct hit Hog 27, the ground controller's voice carried profound relief and gratitude. Threat neutralized, no friendly casualties. You just saved a lot of American lives. As Sarah climbed away from the target area and the simulation wound down, she felt a profound sense of completion that had been missing from her professional life since her exile from combat aviation. She'd proven to herself, if not to her evaluators, that 3 years of intensive preparation could indeed compensate for lack of deployment experience. The question now was whether Krueger and his panel would acknowledge what she'd just demonstrated, or whether institutional bias would override objective assessment of her performance. The post-flight debrief would determine not just her immediate future at Nellis, but whether merit and preparation could ultimately triumph over the political considerations that had derailed her career. As she shut down the simulator systems and prepared to face her judges, Sarah realized that she'd finally found the courage to fight for recognition of what she'd always known about herself, that she was one of the finest A-10 pilots the Air Force had ever produced, regardless of the bureaucratic obstacles that had prevented her from proving it in actual combat. The debrief room felt like a courtroom, as Sarah took her seat across from the evaluation panel, their faces professionally neutral, but their body language radiating the kind of controlled hostility that preceded a predetermined verdict. Lieutenant Colonel Krueger had positioned himself at the head of the table with the authority of a judge preparing to deliver sentence, while Major Santos and Colonel Hayes flanked him like prosecuting attorneys armed with evidence of her inadequacy. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Krueger finally spoke, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone savoring a long-anticipated moment of vindication. "Captain Chen, your technical execution during the simulation was adequate," he began, the word adequate delivered with the dismissive precision of a surgeon making an incision. "Your target identification was generally accurate. Your weapons employment followed established procedures, and your aircraft handling demonstrated basic competency. However, there were significant deficiencies in your performance that raised serious concerns about your ability to provide realistic combat instruction to pilots who will face these challenges for real." Sarah felt her chest tighten as Krueger clicked to his first PowerPoint slide, which showed a tactical diagram of her final gun run annotated with red circles highlighting what he characterized as tactical errors. The presentation had clearly been prepared in advance, suggesting that her actual performance was irrelevant to conclusions that had been reached before she'd ever entered the simulator. "Your decision to engage targets within 30 meters of friendly forces violated established safety protocols," Krueger continued, his laser pointer tracing Sarah's attack geometry with prosecutorial precision. While the engagement was technically successful within the simulation parameters, your willingness to accept such extreme risk demonstrates the kind of reckless judgment that we cannot tolerate in our instructional staff. Students who learn such aggressive tactics from their instructors may attempt similar maneuvers in actual combat, potentially resulting in friendly fire casualties. The criticism stung not because it was accurate, but because it revealed the impossible standards Sarah was being held to. The historical engagement that formed the basis of the simulation had required exactly the kind of aggressive risk-taking that Krueger was now condemning. But Sarah's successful execution of identical tactics was being characterized as evidence of poor judgment rather than exceptional skill. Major Santos leaned forward, her expression sympathetic but her words carrying the sting of institutional dismissal. Sarah, I understand that you've put significant effort into studying these tactical scenarios, and your academic knowledge is impressive. But there's a fundamental difference between understanding what happened in a historical engagement and possessing the combat judgment necessary to make life-or-death decisions under actual pressure. The simulation showed technical competence, but it also revealed gaps in your tactical thinking that could prove dangerous in an instructional environment. The assertion that her tactical thinking was flawed would have been infuriating if it weren't so transparently false. Sarah had executed the mission with precision that exceeded the performance of most combat-experienced pilots, making decisions that saved simulated American lives while achieving all tactical objectives. But her success was being reframed as evidence of recklessness, transforming exceptional performance into a liability through the simple expedient of questioning her motivations rather than her results. Colonel Hayes consulted his evaluation notes with the deliberate movements of someone conducting official business. Captain Chen, during the debrief of your final attack run, you mentioned using techniques that go beyond standard training protocols. Can you explain where you learned these advanced tactics, given your lack of combat deployment experience? The question was a trap disguised as academic inquiry designed to expose the unauthorized simulation work that had formed the foundation of Sarah's expertise. She'd prepared for this moment, crafting responses that acknowledged her additional training without revealing the full extent of her covert preparation, but facing the actual interrogation required careful navigation between truth and self-preservation. Sir, my tactical knowledge comes from comprehensive study of historical engagements, analysis of pilot debriefs, and extensive work with simulation systems to understand how various techniques perform under different conditions, Sarah replied, choosing her words with the precision of someone walking through a minefield. I've spent considerable time studying the tactics used by successful combat pilots, including the specific techniques employed during the Battle of Combat Outpost Keating. Krueger's eyes narrowed with the focus of a predator detecting weakness. Captain, are you telling this panel that you've been conducting unauthorized training sessions using Air Force simulation equipment? Because that would represent a serious breach of regulations governing the use of classified training systems. The accusation hung in the air like an unexploded bomb, its implications clear to everyone in the room. Sarah's unauthorized simulation work had been discovered, probably through routine monitoring of system usage logs that she'd assumed were purely administrative records. Krueger had been building a case against her that went far beyond questions of combat experience, encompassing regulatory violations that could result in disciplinary action or even criminal charges. Sarah's response required careful calibration between honesty and self-protection. Sir, I have occasionally used simulation systems during off-duty hours to maintain proficiency and develop instructional materials. All such usage was conducted with appropriate security clearances and in accordance with my understanding of facility access protocols. Your understanding was incorrect, Colonel Hayes interjected, his voice carrying the authority of someone delivering official policy interpretation. Simulation systems in this facility are restricted to official training activities conducted under proper supervision. Unauthorized use of these systems, even by qualified personnel, represents a serious security violation and misuse of government resources. The trap was closing with bureaucratic precision, transforming Sarah's dedication to professional excellence into evidence of regulatory violations and poor judgment. Her 3 years of intensive preparation were being recharacterized as unauthorized activity that demonstrated unreliability rather than commitment to aviation excellence. Major Santos adopted a tone of concerned mentorship, as if she were trying to help Sarah understand the seriousness of her situation. "Sarah, I think you've lost perspective on the appropriate boundaries between personal ambition and professional responsibility. Your desire to prove yourself has led you to engage in activities that compromise your integrity and call into question your fitness for continued service as an instructor." The psychological assault was methodical and devastating, attacking not just Sarah's professional competence but her character and motivations. The panel was constructing a narrative that portrayed her as someone whose personal frustrations had led to increasingly desperate and inappropriate behavior, culminating in regulatory violations that demonstrated fundamental unsuitability for continued military service. Krueger consulted a thick folder that Sarah now realized contained documentation of her activities spanning the previous 3 years. "Captain Chen, our investigation has revealed a pattern of behavior that raises serious concerns about your psychological stability and professional judgment. Beyond the unauthorized simulation activities, we've documented excessive after-hours presence in training facilities, inappropriate use of classified materials for personal study, and concerning social isolation that suggests difficulty adapting to your current assignment." Each accusation transformed Sarah's strengths into pathologies through the simple expedient of malicious interpretation. Her dedication became obsession, her scholarly approach became inappropriate use of resources, and her professional focus became evidence of psychological problems. The comprehensive case file that Krueger had assembled painted a picture of someone whose career disappointments had led to increasingly erratic behavior that posed potential risks to military operations. Furthermore, Krueger continued, his voice gaining momentum as he detailed the scope of his investigation, "We have concerns about your influence on students who may be adopting inappropriate tactical approaches based on your instruction. Several recent graduates have attempted aggressive maneuvers during their initial combat deployments that mirror the techniques you demonstrated during today's evaluation. While no incidents have resulted in friendly fire casualties, the potential for tragedy exists." The assertion that her instruction was influencing students to adopt dangerous tactics was particularly galling because Sarah knew it was the opposite of truth. Her students consistently received praise from combat squadrons for their thorough preparation and sound tactical judgment, with several receiving commendations for exceptional performance during their first deployments. But positive outcomes were being ignored in favor of theoretical risks that supported predetermined conclusions about her unsuitability. Sarah realized that defending herself against these accusations would only provide Krueger with additional ammunition for his attack. Any attempt to justify her actions would be characterized as defensiveness or inability to accept responsibility, while remaining silent would be interpreted as acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The panel had constructed a scenario where any response she offered would be used against her, creating a psychological trap that complemented the bureaucratic one. "Captain Chen," Colonel Hayes said, his tone carrying the finality of official judgment, "given the serious concerns raised during this evaluation, we're recommending immediate suspension from instructional duties pending a comprehensive investigation into your conduct. You'll be reassigned to administrative duties while we determine the appropriate course of action regarding potential disciplinary measures." The words hit Sarah with the force of a physical blow, not because they were unexpected, but because they represented the culmination of everything she'd feared since Krueger's arrival. Her career in aviation instruction was ending not because of inadequate performance, but because of political considerations and institutional bias that had transformed excellence into liability through bureaucratic alchemy. Major Santos affected an expression of sympathetic concern as she delivered what was clearly intended as the final blow. "Sarah, I want you to understand that this recommendation isn't motivated by any desire to harm your career. We're genuinely concerned about your welfare and believe that you may benefit from counseling to help you process the disappointment of not receiving a combat assignment. Sometimes our ambitions exceed our capabilities, and learning to accept our limitations is part of professional maturity." The condescending dismissal of her abilities as unrealistic ambition was perhaps the most insulting aspect of the entire proceeding. Sarah had demonstrated exceptional competence during the evaluation, but her success was being reframed as evidence of dangerous overconfidence that required psychological intervention. The message was clear. Women who believed they belonged in combat aviation were delusional, and those who persisted in such beliefs despite institutional resistance required professional help. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. As the evaluation panel gathered their materials and prepared to leave, Krueger delivered a parting comment that crystallized everything Sarah had lost and everything the Air Force was throwing away through institutional prejudice. Captain Chen, I hope you'll eventually understand that this decision is in everyone's best interest. The A-10 community requires instructors who can provide realistic guidance based on actual combat experience. Your theoretical knowledge, however comprehensive, simply cannot substitute for the judgment that comes from having been shot at in anger. Perhaps it's time to consider whether your talents might be better suited to a different career field. The suggestion that she lacked the fundamental qualifications for her chosen profession was devastating, not because it contained any truth, but because it represented the triumph of politics over merit that had defined her entire military experience. Sarah had proven her exceptional competence in the most demanding circumstances possible, but that proof was being dismissed in favor of criteria specifically designed to exclude her from opportunities to demonstrate her true capabilities. As the panel filed out of the debrief room, leaving Sarah alone with her shattered career and vindicated suspicions about institutional bias, she realized that her 3 years of preparation had been leading not to redemption but to this moment of ultimate rejection. The Air Force had found a way to eliminate her not because she couldn't do the job, but because allowing her to succeed would challenge assumptions about who belonged in combat aviation that certain leaders were determined to preserve. The investigation that would follow would be conducted by the same people who had predetermined its conclusions, ensuring that her suspension would become permanent exile from the aviation community that had been her entire professional identity. But as Sarah sat in the empty room contemplating the destruction of everything she'd worked toward, she couldn't shake the feeling that Krueger's victory might prove temporary, and that somewhere in the chaos of global military operations, circumstances were developing that would require exactly the skills she'd been forbidden to use. The news of Sarah's suspension spread through Nellis Air Force Base with the velocity of classified intelligence, whispered in hallways and discussed in hushed conversations that stopped whenever senior officers appeared. Within 48 hours of her evaluation debacle, every instructor, student, and support technician knew that Captain Chen had been removed from teaching duties pending investigation into conduct unbecoming and possible regulatory violations. The official story emphasized security breaches and unauthorized use of training equipment, but the unofficial narrative revealed the deeper truth about institutional politics and the price of challenging established hierarchies. Lieutenant Amanda Rivera was among the first to seek Sarah out, appearing at her temporary administrative office in the basement of Building 47 with the determined expression of someone who'd made a difficult decision. Rivera had been one of Sarah's most promising students, a sharp young pilot whose questions during class often pushed discussions beyond standard curriculum into the kind of tactical nuance that separated good aviators from exceptional ones. Her presence in Sarah's cramped new workspace, surrounded by filing cabinets and outdated computer equipment, represented both personal loyalty and professional risk. "Ma'am, I wanted you to know that what happened in that evaluation was complete bullshit," Rivera said without preamble, her voice carrying the controlled anger of someone who'd witnessed injustice but lacked the rank to challenge it directly. "Half the students are talking about it. Everyone knows you're the best instructor in the squadron, and everyone knows why Krueger really wanted you gone." Sarah looked up from the personnel file she'd been assigned to organize, grateful for the support, but concerned about Rivera's willingness to express such dangerous opinions. "Lieutenant, you need to be careful about making statements like that. Colonel Krueger is your chain of command, and questioning his decisions could impact your own career progression." "With respect, ma'am, my career progression isn't worth much if the Air Force gets rid of its best instructors because they don't fit some narrow definition of who belongs in combat aviation," Rivera replied, settling into the single visitor chair with the deliberate movements of someone prepared for a lengthy conversation. "Besides, I'm not the only one who feels this way. There's a group of us who've been talking, and we want you to know that not everyone believes the official story about why you were suspended." The revelation that students were organizing informal support for her case was both touching and terrifying. Sarah had spent her career trying to avoid becoming a symbol of gender discrimination in military aviation, preferring to prove her worth through competence rather than activism. But Rivera's words suggested that her situation had already become symbolic, representing broader issues about fairness and merit that extended beyond her individual circumstances. Over the following days, other students began finding reasons to visit Sarah's administrative purgatory, ostensibly seeking guidance on career decisions or academic matters, but actually expressing solidarity that they couldn't demonstrate publicly. Lieutenant Jake Morrison confided that his combat-experienced flight commander had privately criticized Krueger's evaluation criteria, suggesting that arbitrary standards based solely on deployment history ignored other forms of valuable expertise. Captain Lisa Park mentioned that instructors at other bases were questioning whether Nellis was setting dangerous precedents that could affect training quality across the entire A-10 community. The most significant expression of support came from an unexpected source: Master Sergeant Tony Rodriguez, the night security supervisor whose unofficial cooperation had enabled Sarah's unauthorized simulation sessions. Rodriguez appeared at her office during a late evening shift change, when the administrative building was nearly empty and their conversation would attract minimal attention. "Captain, I heard about what happened with your evaluation," Rodriguez said, his weathered face showing the kind of concern usually reserved for family members facing serious difficulties. "I want you to know that some of us who've been around this base for a while understand what's really going on here. This isn't about security violations or unauthorized equipment usage. This is about certain people not wanting to admit that they were wrong about your capabilities." Rodriguez's perspective carried particular weight because of his extensive experience with multiple base commanders and training philosophies. As someone who'd observed the politics of military aviation from the enlisted ranks for over 20 years, he possessed insights about institutional dynamics that often escaped officers focused on their own career advancement. "Ma'am, I've seen a lot of talented people get pushed out of the Air Force for reasons that had nothing to do with their actual performance," Rodriguez continued, his voice carrying the authority of hard-earned experience. "Usually it happens because they threaten someone's assumptions about how things are supposed to work. Your simulation work wasn't just practice. It was proof that the system had wasted 3 years of exceptional talent for no good reason." The conversation with Rodriguez crystallized something Sarah had been struggling to understand about her situation. Her suspension wasn't just punishment for regulatory violations. It was institutional damage control, designed to eliminate evidence that competent people had been excluded from opportunities based on prejudice rather than merit. Krueger's investigation served to discredit her achievements while preventing awkward questions about why someone of her abilities had been relegated to basic instruction duties. Meanwhile, the broader A-10 community was beginning to take notice of developments at Nellis through informal networks that connected pilots, instructors, and maintenance personnel across different bases. Sarah's reputation as an exceptionally knowledgeable instructor had spread through word-of-mouth recommendations from students who'd been impressed by her comprehensive understanding of aircraft systems and tactical procedures. When news of her suspension began circulating, several combat veterans who'd never met her personally started asking uncomfortable questions about the circumstances. The most significant expression of external support came from an unexpected source: Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a civilian contractor with Boeing's A-10 modernization program, who'd heard about Sarah's situation through professional contacts. Dr. Martinez had been looking for technical consultants with deep knowledge of A-10 systems for an upcoming sustainment study, and Sarah's reputation had brought her to Boeing's attention before the suspension occurred. "Captain Chen, I understand you're facing some challenges with your current assignment," Dr. Martinez said during a carefully arranged phone conversation that avoided discussing classified information while conveying the substance of Boeing's interest. "I want you to know that the civilian sector values technical expertise regardless of deployment history, and there may be opportunities for someone with your qualifications if you decide to explore alternatives to military service." The offer represented both validation and temptation. Boeing's A-10 program offered the chance to continue working with her favorite aircraft while escaping the political constraints that had derailed her military career. But accepting civilian employment would also represent surrender to the forces that had systematically excluded her from combat aviation, abandoning any hope of proving herself within the military system that had shaped her professional identity. As Sarah considered her options, she discovered that her suspension had created unexpected opportunities for reflection and strategic thinking that her previous administrative duties had precluded. Without classes to teach or curriculum to develop, she found herself with time to analyze the broader patterns that had led to her current situation and to consider how those patterns might eventually create opportunities for redemption. Her research into recent A-10 operations revealed concerning trends in mission effectiveness and pilot performance that aligned with her long-standing concerns about training quality. Combat squadrons were reporting higher rates of aborted missions due to pilot uncertainty about target identification procedures. increased reliance on external guidance for tactical decisions that experienced pilots should make independently, and growing anxiety among newer aviators about their ability to perform effectively in high-stress environments. These problems weren't immediately obvious to casual observers, but Sarah's comprehensive knowledge of training methodologies allowed her to identify connections between instructional approaches and operational outcomes that others might miss. The realistic combat simulation that Krueger had implemented was producing pilots who could execute standard procedures under controlled conditions but struggled with the kind of adaptive thinking required when situations deviated from established protocols. More troubling was evidence that the emphasis on combat experience over instructional expertise was creating a feedback loop that reinforced problematic approaches to pilot development. Instructors were teaching techniques that had worked for them personally during specific deployments, but these methods weren't necessarily optimal for different operational environments or pilot personalities. The result was training that reflected individual experience rather than best practices derived from comprehensive analysis of multiple engagements. Sarah's investigation into these trends was necessarily conducted through informal channels and publicly available information, but the patterns she discovered were consistent with her theoretical predictions about the consequences of Krueger's training philosophy. The Air Force was sacrificing instructional quality for the appearance of combat credibility, producing pilots who possessed deployment experience but lacked the fundamental understanding necessary for tactical adaptation. The irony was particularly bitter because Sarah's unauthorized simulation work had been developing exactly the kind of adaptive techniques that operational squadrons were now requesting. Her innovative approaches to target identification, weapons employment, and tactical coordination represented solutions to problems that the conventional training establishment was struggling to address through traditional methods. As winter approached and her investigation continued without resolution, Sarah began receiving indirect messages from operational commanders who'd heard about her situation through professional networks. These communications were necessarily circumspect, avoiding any direct criticism of Nellis' leadership, while expressing interest in her perspectives on training effectiveness and pilot preparation. Yearly, Colonel Patricia Williams, commander of the 442nd Fighter Wing, sent what appeared to be a routine request for information about advanced training techniques, but included language suggesting broader concerns about pilot readiness. Major David Santos, operations officer for a deployed A-10 squadron, submitted official feedback about recent graduate performance that contained coded references to instructional deficiencies that aligned with Sarah's analysis of systemic problems. Most significantly, Brigadier General Catherine Hayes, director of Air Combat Command's A-10 program, scheduled what was officially described as a routine base visit but included unusual requests for meetings with training staff and detailed briefings on instructional methodologies. The timing and scope of her visit suggested that higher headquarters was beginning to take notice of developments at Nellis, possibly in response to concerns raised through channels that bypassed local command authority. The prospect of external scrutiny created palpable tension within the 66th Weapons Squadron, as Krueger and his allies realized that their campaign against Sarah might attract unwanted attention from senior leaders who possessed the authority to reverse their decisions. The suspension that had seemed like a decisive victory was beginning to look like a strategic miscalculation that could expose the political motivations behind seemingly objective personnel actions. As Sarah prepared for what might be her final weeks at Nellis, she couldn't escape the feeling that forces beyond her control were beginning to align in ways that could either vindicate her position or complete her destruction. The support she'd received from students, colleagues, and external professionals provided hope that merit might eventually triumph over politics. But the institutional power arrayed against her remained formidable and determined to preserve existing hierarchies. The resolution of her situation would ultimately depend on whether the Air Force valued instructional effectiveness over bureaucratic face-saving, and whether senior leaders possessed the courage to acknowledge that exceptional talent had been wasted through institutional prejudice. But regardless of the official outcome, Sarah had already achieved something that her opponents couldn't erase: proof that 3 years of dedicated preparation could produce tactical expertise that exceeded the performance of pilots with extensive combat experience. That knowledge would sustain her through whatever challenges lay ahead, providing the foundation for eventual vindication even if immediate circumstances suggested continued exile from the aviation community that remained her professional and personal passion. The emergency alert pierced the pre-dawn silence of Nellis Air Force Base at 0447 hours on a Tuesday morning in December, its urgent tone cutting through Sarah's restless sleep like a blade through fabric. Her small apartment's emergency notification system crackled to life with a message that would change everything. All aviation personnel, this is Base Command. We have a Priority Alpha emergency situation. Operation Iron Thunder has encountered critical complications. Multiple aircraft down. Ground forces in immediate danger. All qualified A-10 pilots report to Emergency Operations Center immediately. Sarah bolted upright, her mind instantly sharp despite having been awakened from deep sleep. Operation Iron Thunder wasn't a training exercise. It was the classified designation for a major offensive operation in Afghanistan's Kunar province, where 300 Marines had been conducting clearing operations against a reinforced Taliban stronghold in the mountainous terrain near the Pakistan border. The fact that Nellis was being tasked to provide emergency support meant the situation had deteriorated beyond the capabilities of forward-deployed assets. As she threw on her flight suit, Sarah's phone erupted with incoming calls and text messages. The first was from Lieutenant Rivera. "Ma'am, something big is happening. They're calling everyone in, even the suspended personnel." The second came from an unknown number but carried the authority of official military communications. "Captain Chen, report to EOC immediately. Signed, Colonel Hayes." The Emergency Operations Center buzzed with controlled chaos as Sarah entered the massive facility that served as Nellis's nerve center during crisis situations. Wall-mounted displays showed satellite imagery of mountainous Afghan terrain, real-time intelligence feeds, and tactical overlays that painted a picture of disaster unfolding half a world away. Senior officers huddled around communication stations while technicians worked frantically to establish secure links with forward-deployed units. Brigadier General Catherine Hayes stood at the center of the operation, her presence at Nellis during this crisis suggesting that her recent visit had been more than routine inspection. As Sarah approached the main briefing area, Hayes turned with the sharp focus of someone dealing with life-or-death decisions under extreme time pressure. "Captain Chen, I need you to listen very carefully," Hayes said without preamble, her voice carrying the urgency of someone who had no time for pleasantries or political considerations. 12 hours ago, 300 Marines from the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment began what should have been a routine clearing operation in the Korangal Valley. Intelligence indicated moderate Taliban resistance in fortified positions that could be neutralized through coordinated air-ground operations. Hayes clicked to a tactical display showing the operational area, a forbidding landscape of steep ridges and narrow valleys that had claimed American lives throughout 2 decades of conflict. The intelligence was wrong. The Marines encountered a reinforced enemy brigade with sophisticated air defense systems, including man-portable missiles and coordinated anti-aircraft artillery. The initial air support package was decimated, 2 Apache helicopters destroyed, 1 F-16 shot down, and multiple aircraft damaged and forced to withdraw. Sarah felt her blood chill as Hayes continued the briefing. This wasn't just a tactical setback. It was the kind of military disaster that could result in massive casualties if immediate action wasn't taken to extract the surrounded forces. The Marines are trapped in 3 separate defensive positions with diminishing ammunition, multiple casualties, and no viable extraction route, Hayes explained, her voice maintaining professional calm despite the magnitude of the crisis. Weather conditions have deteriorated beyond the capabilities of conventional aircraft, and the enemy air defense network has effectively created a no-fly zone over the operational area. Major Santos approached with additional intelligence updates that made the situation even more desperate. "General, latest reports indicate the enemy is massing for a coordinated assault designed to overrun all 3 Marine positions. We have perhaps 6 hours before defensive perimeters are breached, and we're looking at complete unit loss." The implications were staggering. The potential loss of 300 Marines would represent one of the worst single-day disasters in recent military history, the kind of catastrophe that would dominate headlines and trigger congressional investigations. But more immediately, it meant 300 American families facing the devastating news that their sons and daughters had died far from home in a war that most Americans had forgotten was still being fought. Hayes turned back to Sarah with an expression that mixed desperation with determination. "Captain, every A-10 pilot we have available is either deployed, medically grounded, or lacks the specific qualifications for this mission. The weather conditions require instrument flying skills that exceed standard training. The terrain demands navigation precision that few pilots possess. Most critically, the tactical situation requires close air support techniques in extreme proximity to friendly forces, with no margin for error." The subtext was clear. They needed someone with exceptional skills who could execute an impossible mission under conditions that had already defeated multiple aircraft and crews. Sarah realized that her 3 years of intensive preparation, her unauthorized simulation work, and her systematic study of exactly these kinds of scenarios had been leading to this moment. "Ma'am, what specific conditions are we dealing with?" Sarah asked, her mind already racing through tactical possibilities and operational constraints. "Ceiling at 500 feet with embedded thunderstorms, winds gusting to 80 knots, visibility near zero," Hayes replied grimly. "The operational area is a box canyon with 12,000-foot ridges on 3 sides and a single egress route that's covered by enemy air defenses. Standard approach patterns are impossible, and any pilot attempting conventional close air support would be flying directly into prepared kill zones." Sarah's unauthorized simulation work had included dozens of scenarios involving exactly these conditions: mountainous terrain, extreme weather, and close air support requirements that pushed aircraft and pilots beyond normal operational limits. She'd developed techniques for using terrain masking to avoid air defenses, found ways to deliver precision fires in confined spaces, and practiced emergency procedures for situations where standard protocols were inadequate. "General, I can fly this mission," Sarah said quietly, the words carrying more certainty than she'd felt about anything in her professional life. "I've been preparing for exactly this kind of scenario for 3 years." Colonel Hayes, who had been monitoring the conversation, stepped forward with obvious skepticism. "Captain, with all due respect, this isn't a simulation exercise. We're talking about the most challenging close air support mission attempted since Vietnam, under weather conditions that would ground most pilots, against enemy defenses that have already shot down multiple aircraft." But General Hayes was studying Sarah with the calculating expression of someone weighing desperate options against available resources. "Captain Chen, I've been reviewing your training records and the reports from various sources about your unofficial preparation activities. Colonel Krueger's evaluation questioned your judgment, but it also documented performance capabilities that exceed most of our combat-experienced pilots." The recognition that her suspended status and controversial evaluation had actually brought her capabilities to senior leadership attention was both vindicating and terrifying. General Hayes possessed authority that transcended local politics, but she also faced pressures that made failure unacceptable. "Ma'am, I understand the risks and the stakes," Sarah replied, meeting Hayes's gaze directly. "I've spent 3 years studying every aspect of A-10 operations, including scenarios that most pilots never encounter. I know this aircraft better than anyone currently available, and I've developed techniques specifically for the kind of impossible situations that conventional training doesn't address." Hayes made a decision that would change everything. "Captain Chen, you're reinstated to flight status effective immediately. We have one A-10C configured for maximum loiter time and equipped with the latest targeting systems. The mission is voluntary. No one will question your decision if you decline, but if you accept, you'll be attempting something that military aviation experts consider impossible." Sarah looked at the tactical displays showing 300 Marines fighting for their lives in Afghan mountains, and felt the weight of her grandfather's distinguished flying cross in her pocket. Every moment of her 3-year exile, every hour of unauthorized preparation, every simulation she'd flown in secret had been leading to this opportunity to prove what she'd always known about herself. "Ma'am, I accept the mission. Let's bring those Marines home." The rescue mission launched at dawn, with Sarah's A-10 disappearing into storm clouds that had grounded every other aircraft. For 4 hours, radio silence. Then, breakthrough transmissions crackled through. Marines extracted from Position Alpha, moving to Position Bravo, all packages secure. Against impossible odds, flying through weather that meteorologists called unsurvivable, Sarah executed 17 separate gun runs, neutralized 12 enemy positions, and provided continuous cover while helicopters extracted all 300 Marines. Not a single American life was lost. When she finally landed at Bagram Air Base, her A-10 was riddled with bullet holes but still flying. The Marine Battalion commander was waiting on the tarmac, tears streaming down his face as he saluted the woman who'd saved his entire unit. "Captain," he said, "I don't know how you did what you did up there, but 300 families are going home tonight because of you." The news spread through military channels like wildfire. Sarah Chen, the instructor they'd tried to destroy, had just executed the most successful close air support mission in modern military history. Krueger's investigation was quietly closed. Sarah received the Distinguished Flying Cross, the same medal her grandfather had earned, and was promoted to major with assignment to the most elite A-10 squadron in the Air Force. Lieutenant Rivera, now wearing Sarah's father's pilot wings, approached after the ceremony. "Ma'am, you proved that excellence can't stay hidden forever." Sarah smiled, finally at peace with who she'd always been. Sometimes the best response to being underestimated isn't fighting for acceptance. It's quietly becoming undeniably excellent at what you do. What dreams have you been preparing for in secret? Sometimes our greatest challenges become our greatest preparations for moments we never saw coming. Share your story of hidden preparation in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories of people who refuse to give up on themselves. Hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what we have coming next.